This is ContactTalkRadio.com, consciousness in action, and you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to Life Mastery Radio with Todd Allen and Jackie Bailey, the show that dives into the science of higher consciousness with inspiring topics such as abundance, intention, health, manifestation, love, and transformation. Join Todd, Jackie, and their guests of leading authors, speakers, coaches, and entrepreneurs weekly at 10 a.m. Pacific. Learn to live a peaceful life with intentional mastery. It's all right here with stories and messages to support your well-being and most evocative dreams. Now, here's your hosts, Todd and Jackie.
Hi, everybody. It's actually just Jackie today. I am flying solo. Welcome to Life Mastery Radio with Todd and Jackie. But Todd owns a hydraulics and machine shop in Everett, Washington, and he's got pressing business today. And that was intentionally a little punny. And we will miss him and hope all is well. And I am flying solo and enjoying the opportunity to spend some time with a friend of mine, Steve Garvin. Before I actually introduce him, however, I want to give you some housekeeping items about Life Mastery Radio in general. Todd and I are delighted to be here with you every Tuesday morning. Todd is an author, and at lifemasteryradio.com, you can find his tremendous book, The Keys of Life Mastery. And I'm an author as well. You can find my book on the same site. We really want you to become a member of our email list, because when you join our email list, you're going to get the announcements of upcoming guests, what they're all about, what their books are about, what their programs are about, and how you can be inspired by their life stories. And we only send out that newsletter once a week. So you have to get it in order to know who's coming up. If you are also a fan of us on Facebook, you'll find out those details as well. So there's another thing I'm going to ask you to do is join our Facebook page, which is at Life Mastery Radio with Todd and Jackie on Facebook. That way you can always be in touch with us. You can send us messages. You can ask us questions. We're always happy to engage with our audience and hope that you will engage with us. We love to talk to people who have great stories to tell. And our guest today is actually a person who helps you to discover your stories and what to do with those stories. So I'm going to jump right in and introduce Mr. Steve Garvin. Now, he thought his story was worthless until he discovered he'd been playing a role that wasn't his. When Steve became the author of his own story, his self-compassion and self-worth went from barely surviving to thriving. Steve hosts the Sing Your Heart Song Summit, which is the only summit where authors, speakers, and coaches' hearts, souls, and missions sing together in abundance. He is the author of Never Trust Your Money with a Marketer, The 7 Principles of Prosperity Marketers Overlook, and Heart Notes, ta-da! An anthology of inspiring letters to matters of the heart. Steve's mission is to help authors and speakers create greater prosperity through their transformational story. You can find Steve in his Facebook group, which is The Art of Entrepreneurship for Transformational Authors and Speakers. He's also on LinkedIn, and he has a weekly gathering, which we're going to talk about, which is called Share Your Light. Listeners of Life Mastery Radio, please welcome Steve Garvin. Yay! It's wonderful to have you with us, Steve, joining us from North Carolina, right?
Absolutely. It's awesome to be here with you, Jackie.
You know, I don't know if you know who Jeannie Robertson is. She called herself a humorist, and she was a former Miss North Carolina. And she was this beautiful 6 foot tall woman who, when she competed, was probably average as far as her height goes. But she was a professional speaker well into and throughout her 70s. And she was still this gorgeous, tall woman who told the most amazing stories. So for someone who loves stories, Steve, if you don't know who Jeannie Robertson is, you need to find her, look her up, because she tells stories of her life and the life with her husband, whom she rarely ever named his actual name. She always called him Left Brain. So she's got these stories of her and Left Brain, and tremendous humorist. And she was my inspiration to begin speaking. Actually, I heard her in an event, and her stories absolutely astounded me and inspired me so much that I said, that's what I want to do. I want to make someone feel like she just made me feel. And so I want to let our listeners know that you help people to do that. You help people feel their real stories, and then you help them to bring that out on stage. Am I correct, or am I way off base here?
No, you're right on base.
And how do you do that?
Well, the funny thing is, first of all, I just want to touch on the left brain aspect that you referred to with regards to Jenny Robertson and her husband. I have always been in love with stories. I've been to the library zillions of times, and my favorite store ever to go to is the bookstore. In fact, it's one of the few stores that I'm actually happy to spend some time in. Everything else is like, okay, I want to get in and out as quickly as I possibly can. But even with my love of stories, I went a very different path with my career initially than what I'm doing now. And initially, I was more of the left brain type, where I relied on my strength with numbers and technology and so forth, and eventually became a corporate accountant. And I'm still really good with numbers, although my relationship, and in fact, when we talk more about some of the things that I wrote in Heart Notes will come out, my relationship with money has not been always a rosy picture. And one of the things that I believe is that our stories are always percolating underneath the surface, right? That even if we are not out there sharing them with other people, they're still going on inside our head. In fact, I think of it oftentimes as the movie reel that's on constant repeat going on in our minds, right? And we can either let that continue to play and to kind of like keep the door shut to that and pretend like it's not there, just like, as a corporate accountant, where my focus was on numbers and getting the technology to work and, making my corporate customers happy. There was still that story and that passion going on underneath of the story that I really wanted to be telling. But I didn't feel the permission. And ultimately, I discovered that the permission wasn't something that I had to seek out there. It was something that I had to seek in here. And when I finally gave myself permission to start sharing my story, and that took me 40, I don't know, close to 50 years to really start doing, I've went from, as you read in the intro, I went from really struggling and just barely surviving to thriving. I mean, I used to cry Sunday evenings because I knew I had to go into work the next day,
Yeah.
And
was there a one particular event that caused that transformation to happen so quickly, or was this a gradual change in your
Oh my
mindset?
gosh, it was not a quick experience at all. In some ways it was really quick. One of the things that happened was I ended up getting whooping cough and getting it's so bad that I would end up passing out because I'd black out because I didn't get enough oxygen to my brain. And I felt badly that I had to take 3 weeks off, or my doctor actually gave me 4 weeks off from work, but we were at the end of the year and had to get a bunch of work done. And so I went in a week early, and I was expecting to, kind of get a pat on the back. Thank you for coming in early. That was not my experience, to say the least.
Wow.
In fact, it was totally the opposite. And I felt totally dejected. I just was still struggling with this really nasty illness, not getting any appreciation or listening at work. It was, just put your nose to the grindstone and get the work done and, leave everything else at home. So that when I was pulled into my boss's office and the HR director was there, and my boss read this really long list of all the things that she could possibly think of as to what I was doing wrong, half of which were literally made up. I felt about that tall, just about knee high to a grasshopper. And I'd already been struggling with depression. Had been struggling with depression since I was at least a teenager, and, thoughts of suicide and so forth. And that situation was enough for me to not only think about it, but to make plans and to end things. And right before I was going to, on my exit strategy, I was stopped in the restroom, and I hear this voice. One of those things you hear, but you don't, it's not like you hear it. Nobody else in the room would have heard it. That said, don't use a permanent solution to solve a temporary problem. And I'm like, okay. So I pushed pause on my immediate plans and went back to work. And I started to go from, getting that really nasty kind of written, well, not kind of, it was a written warning, and being told that my job was on the line, to the point where just a few months later, I was literally called into the HR director's office this time. And this time my boss was sitting in the corner, and the HR director, as kindly as she possibly could, told me that they were letting me go. And I'm literally biting my tongue because I'm just so happy that I'm being let go.
So you weren't biting your tongue because you were angry. You thought you might say something mean, but you wanted to cheer.
Yes. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best news I've gotten ever. And I say that as I was leaving, and things just kind of aligned such that my cubicle was already totally cleared out. I didn't have a single thing that I had to go get. I could just walk from the HR directors out the front door. Wow. And I oftentimes say that I felt like doing cartwheels out that front door, which is such a huge contrast between where I was just a few months ago in a similar situation. But my relationship with myself had started to change. And rather than trying to please my boss all the time, I was starting to see, whether or not she likes me, whether or not she appreciates me, that's her problem. It's not my problem. I don't need to worry about that. I just need to worry about me. And that was still not a quick journey. It was a matter of months between that first written notice to actually being given what I call my pink slip of opportunity. But it still took me a couple of years to work through all the depression and the struggle of finding and really developing a relationship with myself, and to really figuring out what my story is and what is my role. How do I play the best part that I want to be playing in my life, rather than playing someone else's role that they've handed me the script and it doesn't fit.
Oh, that's so powerful. And as you were talking about this feeling that your boss was giving you, that you were underappreciated and deserving of certain things that you should have had, and yet you made reference to feeling like that as a child or as a younger person as well. And I wonder, probably most of us, rather than continuing to write our story as it comes, we actually put our life into syndication, right? Where we kind of keep replaying the same episodes over and over again, right?
Yes.
And now you're in that position where you're faced with this again, the same scenario again. And this time you make a different choice.
Yes.
And so how did you start to do things differently that began to give you this thriving mode rather than survival mode?
Well, one of the first things that I did was that going back to my childhood, which incidentally, I remember working with a therapist and she invited me to talk with her about my inner child. And my immediate response was, hell no, I'm not.
Not going back there.
That's done. That's past. I'm not talking about it. I'm not dealing with it. Let's just talk about what's going on right now. What I didn't realize was that tape that began to play when I was a 6, 7 year, 8-year-old kid was the same tape that was being played over and over again. Right. And there are two ways that tape can play. It can play in a destructive way where life continues to kind of swirl around the drain, but it can also play in a more creative way where life continues to get better and better. And it's the same story. It's just what we do with the material, right? Is that story dragging me down? Is it pulling me down? Or is it helping me to expand and to grow and to create? So as a child, I was in total awe of my dad, who seemed to be able to put his hand to anything creative and make something really amazing, whether it be a macrame flower pot hanging thing.
Yeah. I remember those macrame hanging things.
Or making a cake for the Cub Scout blue and gold dinner, or he did not draw while I was growing up, but I'd seen some of the drawings that he did when he was in college, and he was talented. I mean, and I never felt like I could compare to him. So I said, okay, well, I'm not going in that direction. I will meet him and beat him in something else. And growing up, I did not have much of a relationship with my dad. And he was always busy in his head in some book or, doing schoolwork or whatever. And he was always a bit loose. I did not have much relationship there. And which changed after I graduated. He came out of the closet, and some other things that happened that we began to really develop a relationship. But my creativity that began when I was a 6-year-old kid and creating my first book, which was a kind of a crayon and a little bit of story about lions and tigers and bears and so forth. That was the first and last time that I'd created a book, and put all that aside because I needed to prove myself. And the way that I was going to prove myself was to one, do things that I knew I could get the right answer with, which is one of the things that's nice about numbers and math and accounting and so forth, is that within certain parameters, whether or not you've come up with the right answer or not, right? Whereas with creativity, there's a lot more wiggle room as to whether or not it's right or good or enough or whatever. So when I left corporate finance, I began to engage with that creative side of myself. In fact, one of the very first things that I did after I left corporate finance was get certified as a creatively fit coach. With Whitney Freya was the coach who led the course and wrote the book, and I started painting and doing jewelry making and paper mache and all kinds of things, and just really expressing and finding my creative voice.
Now, was your father still alive then? And was he
was
proud of you for this?
Well, actually, sort of. He actually, I received my pink slip in March of 2013. Dad, I got a phone call in May of 2013 from a surgeon saying, we operated on your dad today. He fell down while he was on a walk from his assisted living facility to the park that was just north of where he lived, fell down, hit his head, had a stroke, and we don't really know what the sequence of events was, but he ended up in the hospital having brain surgery. Initially, they thought things were going to go well, and then he just took a turn for the worse. And that's when I got a call at 3 a.m. from the surgeon saying things don't look good and you need to be out here ASAP. Wow. And I was living here in Asheville, North Carolina, and he was back in Tacoma, Washington. So I packed my bag, got on the next flight, and was out there and was with him the last 4 days of his life. And he never came. He was in a coma, never came out of it. But I was there with my mom and my sister when he passed. So wow. We never really got to talk. And there are so many conversations that I wish we had been able to have, talking about art, talking about, how do we connect? How do we relate to God, to community, to our family? And particularly one of the things that I really wish we had the conversation about was that, unbeknownst to me at that time, was that my daughter was having conversations with friends at school about being bisexual. And I didn't know about that until 7 years later, but it was about the same time that Dad passed. And Dad, he wasn't well, I guess he kind of sort of was. He was gay, but he was also married to my mom. And, lots of conversations that I wish that we'd had that we never had, which is one of the many reasons why story is so important to me, and why it's so important for us to share our stories as we live our lives, not at the end of our lives. Because our stories. Do you feel like
your dad had repressed his story a lot?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh, in so many ways. There were so many things that the dad did not talk about him. He was in the Navy in the Korean War, and we got in the, I don't know, however many years, 50 years almost, of being with him, that, we had a few sentences of that part of his life. There was just so many things that he never shared. I think and it wasn't because by this time we had a pretty decent relationship and we were talking, pretty frequently. He did open my eyes to the beauty of the world and of art and so forth. I remember one moment that'll always be emblazoned in my mind and my memory. We were along the beach in Rialto Beach.
Beautiful area.
Just walking along the boardwalk, and it was sunset. And Dad was just looking up in the sky and seeing all the colors and everything. And just the way that he was talking about what he was seeing made me realize that he was seeing things that I wasn't seeing. That because of and by that time he'd re-engaged with his artistic expression and doing watercolor painting and so forth. And just because of that artistic vision that he had, he saw much more depth and nuance and so forth in the landscape that was before us. And that was a real awakening moment for me, that we don't have to see, that we don't see things the same way as other people, and that and even for us, we can expand our vision such that, what we see today, looking at the same thing tomorrow or in a week or a year or whatever, the same exact situation, because our vision has either clouded up or cleared up, we can see things that we didn't otherwise see.
Yeah, that's cool. But that's all part of our story, right? So when you say we should know our story, I get the feeling that what you're saying is we need to know who we are. That's typically based on the experiences we've had and the way that those experiences have shaped our character, right? And given us the truths that we know, the value system that we live by. That's all part of our story. Is that true? Because when you say knowing your story is a pretty general term, and maybe some listeners don't know what that means in a general sense. And that when you're helping people to discover their story, you're really helping them to to look at those patterns of their life that have created who they are right now, and to appreciate the experiences they've had that have shaped them into the person that they are, but that their story's not over, that they continue to write the story of their life through the experiences that they want to have or will continue to have, even those that perhaps are unplanned, that we had just, those crises we had to deal with. So how do you start to help someone to work through this process of looking back at the experiences of their life? What do you help them?
Sure. So one of the first things to look at is to look at today, because just as we talked about earlier, those stories that started when we were a child that continued to play until today, well, it's still playing today. And so if we, open up that theater door, and go in and pay attention to what's going on today, that'll give us clues as to what's happened in the past. And it'll also give us clues as to what will happen in the future, right? That when we start paying attention to our lives, and rather than being present in the moment, being present to, okay, it's interesting that I responded to this situation in this way. What happened there? Why did I respond to things that way? What was going on, not just externally, which is oftentimes the first clue, but internally. When we start diving in and digging into what's going on in our heart space, that'll tell us things that we wouldn't otherwise know. And one of the challenges that we have in such a rich and abundant world is there's lots of stuff out there to get to capture our attention, right? Such that we spend most of our time looking out there rather than spending the time to look in here. And so how do we make time for ourselves to do that introspection, to reflect, to look and see, what is it that I really want? What is it that I want to be creating in my life? What is it that is important to me? What are my desires? What are my disappointments? What are my delights?
Well, sounds too like knowing our story is healing. I mean, because
absolutely.
If there's trauma back there in our story, being able to view that from a different perspective at a later time in your life is very healing. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day, and I was telling them a little bit about what it was like when I went back to school every year, and we always got new clothes, but here's how it went. With the 5 children that my parents had, we would go to the store, we'd each pick out a couple of outfits, or in my case, I always picked out a couple of dresses and some shirts or something like that. And I always loved clothes. I always loved clothes. And so I'd pick out something I'd really love. And then my mom would say, well, we're going to put this on layaway because we can't afford this all right now. So once it's paid off in a couple months, we'll be able to take it home. And I mean, that was the way it was every fall when school started. And I was telling this to this person I was talking to. She goes, so you have a layaway life. And I'm like, that is exactly right. Because I still act on that expectation today. It's like, I really want that. But for some reason, I tell myself, well, I can't have it now. I have to wait for that. It seems like I'm always waiting.
Yes.
To get what I want. Yes. And that's part of my story. But that's part of the story that I now have the control to change. I couldn't change it back then because I was a child, and I couldn't go out and get a job and get money so I could buy my own clothes at that point at 8 years old. But now there is more control, even if it's just in the thought patterns that I put into that, where if I think I really want that, well, maybe I can't have it in that moment, but now I have the ability to say, all right, I'm going to get that in the next 6 months. And this is my plan to be able to do that. Right now I could create a plan to do it on my own accord. And so sometimes we still play those same storylines out in our life. And I realized, and I wrote a chapter in your book. And so before I talk about my chapter, let's talk about then you've done some stuff. 2021 was a big year for you. Yeah, some big changes that came along. When we talk about creativity, you saw this is either going to be a bad situation or I can now take control over this and do something different. I don't have to have the layaway life, right? I can do something now. I don't have to wait for the pandemic to be over. So tell us a little bit about what you did and how this book came about. And then we'll talk about what's in here and maybe even share a little bit about what I contributed to it.
Yes, definitely. And yes, let's definitely share what you contributed to that, because while you were sharing your story, I was thinking exactly of the heart note that you contributed to that book. But what happened for me in 2021 is I had been talking for, I don't know, at least a couple of years about holding a summit and, hosting a podcast and that type of thing. But it was always kind of like that layaway plan. It's like, okay, I don't have what I need right now in order to make it happen. I've got to lay it away, and some point in the future, I'll be able to do it. And what I realized is that I could continue to make investments, make deposits towards that layaway, or I can step into, let's see what we can do right now. How can we bring what's in the future closer to me today, right? One of the cool things about a book is that, if you're reading a novel or something, and the conclusion of the book is back here and you're somewhere in the middle, right? That's still that book, that story has both the beginning, the genesis of that story, and has the middle, the turning point of that story, and it has the conclusion of that story. So, we don't have to wait. We don't have to put our life on layaway in order for us to experience what it is we want to be experienced. We have a powerful movie theater of the mind, right? That if we can step into what it is that we desire and bring it closer to us just through doing vision boards or through doing visualization or, meditation. I mean, there's lots of ways that we can bring that future idea closer to us today, such that we can receive particularly the emotional benefits of what that is that we want in the future today. Like when I went from severe depression to, loving life and loving waking up Monday morning and getting back to work, the turning point for me was not so much about what I was doing, although that was part of it, but it was who I was being. Who was I being in that moment? And I can choose to be who I want to be at any one moment. I don't have to have the external validation line up in order for me to be happy with creating what it is that I'm creating. So some of the ways that showed up for me in 2021 was hosting the first summit that I'd hosted in 5 years. It showed up as in a response to one of the movies that I watched, Collateral Beauty, which I talk about in this book. I watched Collateral Beauty, I don't know, sometime late in the fall or thereabouts. And I was just struck by how Will Smith's character wrote these letters to time, love, and death, and the response that he got from those entities turned his life around, such that where he was kind of circling down the drain himself because of a tragic event that had happened in his personal life, he began to re-engage with life, re-engage with his business, re-engage with his friends, re-engage with, the people that he really cared about. And I thought, well, what if we have another one of the Sing Your Heart Song Summits coming up in, a short period of time. And I'm like, well, what if we did Heart Notes? And we actually didn't call it Heart Notes at that time, but as it evolved, it became what we were calling Heart Notes. And so we were talking about doing Heart Notes with regards to that fall Sing Your Heart Song Summit. And then one of my co-hosts, Olivia, made the recommendation, well, let's make this into a book. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's make it into a book. And we had no idea what we were getting our hands into, but we didn't let that stop us, and we made it happen. And such that, now instead of just dreaming and publishing a book on my layaway plan, I'm making it happen. And really where I'm at with that now is, how can I do that more? How can I live into what it is that I want? How do I bring it closer to me today whether that's just, again, through visualization, or whether it's, making sure that I'm writing, or in my case now, editing every day in order to bring what it is that I want to be happening and what I want to be publishing for it to be published. And one of the things that I find fascinating, I love the etymology of words, but that word publish is the same genesis, same root as public. That when we publish something, we're not just, sending something off to Amazon or to Random House or whatever, but we're making what's going on inside of us, our story inside, public, that we're making it accessible for other people to benefit from the story that we have been telling ourselves and are learning to tell even better.
Yeah, I think even if it's never actually published, there is this therapeutic reason for writing.
Yes.
You're putting your story down on something, right?
Yes, absolutely.
There is, I learned during my healing process from childhood abuse, I learned that there is a very strong relationship between what's in the head and the heart and what comes out with the hands.
Yes.
And so when you can take what's logically in your mind, but also the emotions that are in your heart, and you just write it out, a longhand I found was much more powerful than typing. Writing longhand, either the answers to questions that you've received, like tell me about your first memory of family vacation or whatever, and just starting to write those things. There's something that really happens, and it's healing. It's like it's leaving your body. The bad emotions are leaving you through your hands, and you're almost like discarding the bad stuff, but then you're also re-internalizing the good stuff. And it's so, in so many ways, it was therapeutic to me. And so even if you never plan on publishing anything, I mean, I know a lot of people that will put together a book of family stories and just publish it in such a way that it's just bound. But then they give that away as gifts. They don't publish it. It's not actually out there for anybody else to purchase, but they bind it with a hardcover, soft cover, whatever. And then they just give those stories to other family members as gifts. And I've received a few of those books. My sister is a great genealogist, and so she knows all these stories from years back. And she's put together some things like that over the years for all of us. And it's really special because now it's not just about dates of when people lived and when they died and even where they lived. It's who they were. What did they do? What did they contribute to their community? What did they, was she a school teacher or was he the city sheriff? Things like that, that's when you connect to who you are. So it's not just your stories either. It's looking back, it's learning the stories that came before you that create this chain of everybody's story. We're all connected somehow. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And, there's two things to that I want to touch on is, even if we are just writing for ourselves, getting what's going on inside out onto paper, or in my case, I've got a fused wrist. And so I don't write very longhand. So I do almost all my writing on the computer. But either way, I think the important thing is do what works for you. But when we take what's going on inside of us, I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is, we can have an idea that's circulating in our minds, it's going around and around. And it can go on for, we can let that, as my wife and other people call it, that earworm, where you hear a little bit of a song and you can't get that tune out of your head until you do something with it. That one of the things that we can do with that is that we can write it out, and when we write it out, when we see it expressed into the world, then it goes from being this thing that kind of tumbles around in our minds and our souls to being something that we can literally see on paper or on screen or whatever. And because of that, then our relationship with that story, with that earworm or that idea or that desire transforms from just being something that remains unexpressed to something that is expressed. The other thing I want to talk about in regards to that is that the very most important person in your audience is the person that you see in the mirror. that the story that we are telling ourselves is a story that impacts and is included in every other story that we tell. So we can focus on story as being a marketing means, and it definitely is a very powerful marketing and teaching tool. But if we don't get in touch with our story, we don't really understand the story that we're telling other people. That for us to really have the impact and for us to have the consciousness of what our story might be for someone else, then we have to understand our story from our perspective, and how do we relate to our story and not just have it be, some marketing mechanism or something.
So are you saying it's good then to be able to step back after we've written our story, step back as if it's not our story for a moment and read it again as if we're reading about someone else? Does that give us a certain type of perspective that we don't get any other way?
It does. In fact, one of the things that I have done when I've struggled to deal with a couple of things, like when my wife, when we first got married, one of the things that happened for us is that a lot of the childhood trauma that she'd experienced, that she'd suppressed for years, began to emerge. And I didn't have any way of dealing with that myself, because for one thing, it had happened 20 years before, and the people involved were elsewhere, and it's a little bit like your story, and that there were perpetrators that as much as I would have loved to gotten my hands on them, I couldn't do that. Right. And so what I did is I wrote a novel about it, and audience of one, but just telling that story. And it was a totally different story, different situation, different events, different setting. Everything about it was different, but there was enough of a resemblance to the story that my wife had suffered through, that I was able to process what was my response to that. How do I relate to that? How do I get that out there? The other thing is that when we I think telling stories, both our true stories, and as well as the stories that we imagine, just having a dream, that our mind is honestly always telling us as we dream things that, we can have some really, and recently I've started to remember more of my dreams. And one of the things that I am realizing as I do that is just how bizarre some of those dreams are. And so, totally different settings, totally different people. It's like, where did this come from? Because that certainly never happened in real life, but there's still messages in there that inform us and that help us to see things a little bit more clearly, right? That when we open up to these different possibilities. So for me personally, I totally value both the fictional stories and the non-fictional stories. For me, there isn't that much of a difference between the two, because they're both valuable. Think about, some of the great fictional stories that have been told that have made a huge difference in the world. For me and my family, one of those stories, for both good and bad, is, the Harry Potter series. When my oldest daughter was struggling to read in school, and struggled for years, and still her mind processes. She's not exactly dyslexic, but it is along those lines where the letters get twisted around it a bit, and I don't really understand how it works. But but she was struggling in it and feeling really kind of beat up by school, that she fell in love with the Harry Potter books. And I don't know how many times she has read them now, but she's read the whole series multiple times. Having those characters to relate to, having those people that brought the reader into their world and began to look at things differently, so there's an incredible amount of value in both the true stories as well as the fictional stories that create a world. That's and we have the opportunity.
Go ahead. I was just going to say the classics have always been my favorite because of that. I'll read a classic book. Wuthering Heights I've read over and over and over again because it affects me so deeply. So I didn't want to interrupt, but I see what you're saying now for the first time. I just got a new perspective on that.
And one of the things that I find interesting, I was just listening to another podcast yesterday, the Business of Story podcast, and the guest on there literally went from starting a business in his garage, literally, and doing a bunch of things that were kind of were creating the story for the business. And there were things that he had to create, and the host of the podcast made the point that, he was creating a fictional story because what he was creating in his mind and his vision hadn't happened yet. So it wasn't like a historical document, but he lived into that fictional story such that eventually he sold that business to Home Depot. And for, I don't know what he sold it for, but I know that the revenues for the company went from, a few $100s to now annual revenues of $1 billion. And it was all because of this story that he created in his mind. And it's like, well, what if we did this, and just kept on expanding and growing into this larger story of what the business could be.
Right. When you think of Star Wars came out in the 70s when I was a young girl. And of course, then my children saw it and now their children are watching it. So my grandkids, that's 3 generations that Star Wars has affected. And also, I think, when you're talking about even fictional books having such an impact, L. Ron Hubbard wrote a novel that has now become a religion, right? So they do have an impact. And you gave me a new perspective on that as you were talking about that. So thank you. But let's get to your book, because we've got about 10 minutes left and I don't want to not get there.
Yes.
So you were having these summits, the summits that you have 2 or 3 times a year, or 3 or 4
3 times a year now.
3 times a year. They're the Sing Your Heart Song Summit.
Yes.
And speakers at the summit will share parts of their story or their heart song, kind of the same thing, right?
Yes.
And now you've taken some of those messages and you've allowed contributions into a book called Heart Notes. And so each chapter in this book is someone's letter to a matter of their heart, right? So they're writing it to their heart in some way. That's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea. There's some really beautiful letters in this book. You've written several letters in this book. Do you want to tell us about some of the letters that you've written in your book?
Sure. And I'm hoping that you have the opportunity to share the letter that you wrote in there as well. I wrote 3 letters to money. I published 3 letters. I actually wrote many times more than that. But the letters that I published were letters to money, to abundance, and to little wins. And the one that really stands out to me is the letter to money. Because when I left corporate finance, I literally wanted nothing to do with math, with numbers, with accounting, with any of that stuff. In fact, my wife took over the finances. I even avoided going to the grocery store because I didn't want to deal with money in any fashion. I mean, I don't know what the word would be, but I became a bit of a hermit with regards to the financial world, just because I had experienced so much pain in that last job that I had. In writing the letter to money, one of the things that I realized was that it wasn't money that was the problem. It was, and one of the things about the process of writing these heart notes is that it's, lots of people have asked me, well, what does this look like? How do I write a heart note? And basically it's whatever that thing is that your heart is concerned about, either positively or negatively. If it were sitting in front of you, or if it were, something that you could put a heart note in an envelope and send it off to somebody else, this entity, so money or abundance, or in your case, lack, that you could write that and send it and express yourself to that character, right? Kind of like writing to Santa Claus, it's like,
right.
But as we write these letters, as we pour out our heart and put it on the page, there are things that get expressed that we hadn't realized before, right? As I'm writing this letter to money, I'm realizing that even though I had lots of conflicted emotions around money, that money was more of a casualty of the relationships that I had in the job that I had than it was with money itself. And the way that I describe it in the heart note is basically it's as if my parents, my financial parents, maybe mom cash and dad, I don't know, accounts receivable or something, but got into this heated debate and they split. And, I'm kind of the casualty of that relationship. And I totally blame money for causing that problem, even though it wasn't money that was the problem. It was my relationships themselves, but it was also my relationship to everything that was around that. And that I could actually start, just like I did with my dad, when I was in my early 20s, I went from having not much relationship with him at all to having a pretty good, caring, deep relationship with him.
Yeah.
And similarly with money, and it is still very much an evolving process. My wife still does the budget and pays the bills and does that, but I have started at least on a weekly basis just to open up my accounts and look what's in there and do some more accounting type stuff and it's all part of the healing process. How do I change my relationship with this entity, this idea of money, of abundance? And I guess in a way, it's also tying in the idea of the third letter that I wrote, which was to little wins, that it doesn't have to be this huge, massive accomplishment. It can be just a small step in the right direction. And that small step in the right direction done repeatedly and consistently creates a huge result in the end, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's really powerful. And money is, the scriptures say money is the root of all evil, right? But I'm not sure that that's necessarily directly true. I think it's more like money can be what shapes your attitude about so many other things.
Yes.
Because it is something that we have to have in order to have other things or to be able to do other things. And so it is this centralized tool that either we see in a good, healthy way, or we see it as something that prevents us from having something.
Yes.
Which might be a good way to lead into my chapter, which is on lack. It's very short, and I'd be happy to read it to you.
Sure.
It is on page 15 of the book, where it says, it's just called Dear Lack. You've been my constant companion for many years. I don't want you around anymore, but can't seem to shake you. My parents introduced us, and since they're no longer alive, I want you out. I don't love you, and now I realize I never have. Your clingy personality and need for attention no longer serves me. I've met someone else. Abundance. It's time I give this new relationship a chance. Good luck and good riddance, Jackie.
Awesome.
But the whole book is full of little things like that allow you to feel this emotion that perhaps connects to you. We've got letters to procrastination, letters to perfection, to fear, to the inner child. There's a few of those, to my future self. And this is a wonderful book that is on Amazon. You can purchase it there. You also have a website where they can purchase it. Is that true, Steve?
Well, I have a page on my website that actually shares, I think, 15 or 16 backstory conversations that I had with different contributors, including you, on that.
Yeah. So you've got, there's this giftsintogold.com. Heart Notes Anthology. Is that where they could see the
Yes.
book? Okay.
Yes.
The Sing Your Heart Song Summit, which is coming up in July. You can find out about that at singyourheartsong.com.
Singyourheartsongsummit.com.
Sing Your Heart Song. Oh, is it? In the book,
Yeah.
it says singyourheartsong.com, but it's singyourheartsongsummit.com. Okay. So those are some places you can go to learn more about Steve, to get a hold of this book, and think about what letter you would write. What is the letter you would write? And contact Steve to have him help you get to that story that's inside of you so that you can write that letter or sing your heart song, one or the other.
Absolutely.
Steve, it's been delightful to have you with us today on Life Mastery Radio. I know Todd would have enjoyed talking with you as well. I appreciate very much what you have contributed to the planet. And I'm so happy that we met. You've been a great supporter and contributor to the nonprofit, the Speak Feed Lead Project. You've been on our little fundraisers and our summits as well. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. You are helping me to give children voice and help them to discover their own stories. And no matter what age you are, knowing our story is beneficial. So Steve, thank you, Steve Garvin, for being on Life Mastery Radio today. Thank you all for listening, for joining us. Please make sure that you check out our blog and everything about what's coming up on the show at lifemasteryradio.com. And for now, we hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to Life Mastery Radio. Join Todd Allen and Jackie Bailey and their guests of leading authors, speakers, coaches, and entrepreneurs weekly at 10 a.m. Pacific. Learn to live a peaceful life with intentional mastery through stories and messages to support your well-being and most evocative dreams. Visit their website, www.lifemasteryradio.com. Join their mailing list and be notified about upcoming guests. That's lifemasteryradio.com.